Yeah, I think
Screen.
Okay. So, good evening, respected teachers and dear friends. Almost all of you will get a hip case in your examination, maybe around 99%. Some people may get, spine cases as a long case, but hip case is almost always there in the examination. There will be variety of hip cases, and it's extremely important for you to know every tidbit about the hip examination, because all the examiners are there so acquainted with hip examination questions that they will ask you and they will catch you if you are making a silly mistake there. Now, this S. Das book, Just Make Your Bible, clinical examination by S. Das, and here the long case is given how to proceed in an order. This is my own book which I purchased in 1986 during my undergraduate period, more than 35 years now. Still I'm having it, and even today before the lecture also I went through it, and every time I read it I get some new points there. So make it as a Bible. Now, first and most important thing when you approach a hip case, history. History gives you almost 50% of the diagnosis. You can guess that what is this case. So the age of onset is important, because in certain age, certain conditions are very common. Less than 5 years, usually, dysplastic hip or developmental dysplasia of the hip. 5 to 10 years, you get usually Perthes disease. 10 to 20 years, or teenagers, you get slipped capital femoral epiphysis. Now, 20 to 40 years, you get all the inflammatory arthritis like rheumatoid arthritis, avascular necrosis, all these conditions. 40 to 60 years, you get all the secondary osteoarthritis, secondary to trauma, secondary to any other condition. And beyond 60 years, usually it is the primary osteoarthritis, which is not very common in our country, but seen in many cases. As you know, tuberculosis is a very common condition in our country. It can affect any age. So any age, just keep a tuberculosis in the mind, tuberculosis of the hip. Next, we'll discuss pain, swelling, loss of function, limping, and leg length discrepancy in a particular order. I'll describe a little bit more in detail. Now, did the patient have a fall? First, take a history of fall or any other injury, because that excludes 50% of your conditions. Trauma is, almost in orthopedics, 50% is trauma, 50% is cold orthopedics. So is there any history of fracture, any muscle tear, any hematoma that you have to take in the history? If the patient is playing sports, is there a muscle tear or labral tears that you can guess? It's a young patient, there is a possibility of labral tears. Is there any prolonged exercise or exertion, then the pain starts, then it might be arthritis. If there's a gradual onset versus sudden onset usually follows a trauma, and a gradual onset, of any condition or any pain or anything, it may be arthritic condition like rheumatoid or osteoarthritis. Now, let us come little bit focus on the pain. The pain, if it's localized to the anterior aspect of the hip, there is a possibility of fracture neck femur or arthritis. Is there a hip flexor muscle spasm or labral tear? These are the conditions usually localized to anterior aspect. If the pain is on the lateral aspect, then it might be related to a trochanter or greater trochanter bursitis, or due to iliotibial band, that may be friction, iliotibial band friction syndrome, or gluteus medius is attached there, gluteus medius tear, or there is a malunited trochanteric fracture or anything related to a trochanter. Posterior aspect, again, fracture neck of the femur or any dislocation of the hip or any spine related pain usually radiates to the posterior aspect of the hip joint. And in the groin pain, usually indicates the acetabulum. Remember, any pain around the groin is usually acetabulum. Any pain around the thigh is on the femoral side. So these are the two things you must remember related to the pain. Now, the onset of the pain, when did it start? Okay, whether it started immediately after the fall or after some time after the fall, like that. Whether it's a duration in hours, days, weeks, or years. What is the character of the pain? If it's a sharp pain, there may be fracture or muscle tear. If it's a dull pain, then arthritis. Whether it is radiating to the medial aspect of the knee, especially in children, when you see a slipped capital femoral epiphysis or Perthes disease, patient may complain of pain in the knee, but when you examine the pain, you don't find anything. Just examine the hip quickly, you will find there is some pathology in the hip. So most of the time, the children, they point pain at the knee. That is because of the radiation of the hip pain towards the knee joint because of the common nerve supply. Now, what are the aggravating and relieving factor? Arthritis usually worsens, by day and relieved by rest. It's a mechanical type of pain. If there's a trauma, it aggravates by moving the limb and relieved by rest and analgesic. Most of the muscle trends, they get, aggravated by using that particular muscle. That muscle goes into spasm by using that muscle. You have to take the history of analgesic intake, that how many analgesic is taken and how many days and what is the duration of intake of analgesic. By that you can guess the pain which is excruciating mechanical type of pain. They get aggravated with activity but relieved by rest. When the patient takes rest, the pain is relieved. Most likely there is no night pain, and in night there pain is relieved. Whereas inflammatory pain like rheumatoid arthritis, they get aggravated in the rest. That's why morning stiffness you find in rheumatoid arthritis. But as the activity increases, the pain gets usually relieved because that the factors of inflammation which are released, they get accumulated, and once the patient is mobilized, they get released into the surface pain. They are present both in rest and during activity. Though it is present in the rest, if activity increases, the pain gets aggravated. So in both the pain is persisting, that means it is infective or a neoplastic type of pain. So remember this table, it is extremely important for you while taking the history. Now, history of swelling. What is the site of the swelling? What is the size of the swelling? When there is the onset of the swelling? What is the duration of the swelling? Whether it is associated with pain and progressed over time. There is a chapter on swelling in the Esda's book. So you go through that chapter again. You have to come and detailed. You have to examine the swelling and talk about this swelling part. Usually, limping is not noticed by the patients. It is noticed by the relatives. What is the onset of limping? What is the duration of the limping? Whether the limping is associated with pain? What is the progression of the limping? Gradually, does it deteriorate? And what is the ambulatory status of the patient? Is he using a stick or a cane or any walker or anything? And from that, you will get to know, of course, a little bit about the gait, that whether there's a lurching gait, which is always painful. Remember, if you are talking about lurching, then it is always a painful gait. Whereas Trendelenburg gait may not be painful, but it is seen usually in unilateral coxavara, unilateral congenital dislocation of the hip. But waddling gait is in a bilateral CDH or bilateral coxavara, you get waddling type of gait. Now, any past history of trauma, that there is a 2 years, 3 years back, has a history of trauma, operated, patients are all right, now is getting pain for the last 6 months or something like that. Whether the past history of tuberculosis, is there any surgery around the hip region? Is there any skin disorders and what are the drugs taken? Is there any neurological disorders? Steroid intake is extremely important in our country because most of the patients will find avascular necrosis. Any other significant neurological, medical, or surgical illness you must ask in the history. Now, the steroid intake history you may not get directly. So you ask the patient whether any chronic conditions like bronchial asthma, any kidney condition like nephrotic syndrome, or any skin condition, chronic skin condition. These are the 3 important conditions. Remember, this steroid is commonly prescribed by the physicians in these 3 conditions. So if these 3 conditions are associated with the patient, then you may be sure that there must be history of intake of steroids. Or sometimes you find young patient bodybuilding, they go to gym and etc. They want to quickly develop the muscle. They take steroids and they land up in avascular necrosis. And right now, of course, because of the pandemic, you have to take the history of any COVID infection. If there's a coronavirus infection, and usually they are treated with steroids from the beginning. And nowadays we are seeing many patients coming with avascular necrosis of the hip due to intake of steroids because of treatment with COVID-19 infection. So that is more important nowadays. You may find patients with a history of corona infection. It's personal history. What is the occupation of the patient? What is the work tolerance? Because your treatment regime will depend on the occupation of the patient, whether it is a sedentary worker or is a daily laborer, does heavy work, he has to do ground level activities, then your treatment modality will change accordingly. what diet the patient takes. Smoking, alcohol, these are important for avascular necrosis point of view. Smoking has got a cumulative effect on development of avascular necrosis. Alcohol has got a, again, cumulative effect, that you ask that how much alcohol does it take and how long it takes. If he takes about 400 ml of alcohol per week for the more than 10 years or so, then development of avascular necrosis is extremely high. Menopausal history, you have to take whether the patient attained early menopause in the case of females. So that is it, that may lead to a development of osteoporosis early in the life. Family history, is there any close contact suffering from tuberculosis? Is there any family history of dysplasias or any multiple epiphyseal dysplasias which runs in the family? Metabolic storage disorders like Gaucher's disease, Niemann-Pick's disease, all these things are metabolic storage diseases. Any multiple, inflammatory arthritis like rheumatoids, etc., it runs in the families. Now, next we come to the examination. So after taking the history, almost 50% diagnosis is done. If you are, intelligent enough, you can guess that patient is having tuberculosis, or patient is having probably avascular necrosis, or a patient having, dislocation or, dysplastic hip, which is neglected from the childhood. All these things you can know, or a, neglected infected hip, you can know from the history. Almost, 50% diagnosis is done. Next, we come to the examination. The prerequisites that you have to expose the patient adequately and cover the private parts so that you can examine the hip like this. In case of males, you can make them wear some kind of underwear like a chaddi or underwear. In case of females, you have to protect the privacy of the females. The patient should be dressed enough to cover the private parts. You should take a hard bed. If hard bed is not available, at least a firm bed should be available. You have to mark the skin with a skin marker. And if there's a female patient, be sure that there is a sister standby, or at least sister is not available, then a relative should be there with the patient when you're presenting the case or when you're examining the patient. As you know, every orthopedic examination goes by this order: inspection, palpation, movements, measurements, special tests, gait, and other system examination like spine and sacroiliac joints. So you inspect the patient from the front, behind, and from both the sides in standing as well as in supine positions, from top to bottom. Look for the attitude, swelling, mass, scars, sinuses, any deformity. So from the front, how you look? You look the attitude and alignment. For example, from this patient, as you can see, is bending forward. Whether there is there any fixed deformities. Look for the anterosuperior spine. Are they both level, at the same level? The knee and the ankle, whether they are both the same level or there is any discrepancy. Is there any gross wasting visible to the eye, wasting of the adductors and quadriceps especially? And is there any swelling, scar or sinus which is visible? Sometimes in a childhood drainage of an abscess around the hip, you can see a sinus or a scar there. From the behind, it is obvious that there is a scoliosis is there. You see both the posterior superior iliac spines, whether they are at the same level or at a different level. Look for the gluteal folds, whether there is any wasting of the glutae, hamstrings. One word of caution is there: if there is flattening of the buttocks, there may be loss of gluteal fold due to the flexion of the limb. So if there is a flexion deformity, that may lead to a flattening of the buttocks, and erroneously may put it as the there is a wasting of the muscles of the buttocks. From the side, you see, is there any kyphosis or exaggerated lordosis? As you can see here, there's a flexion deformity of the hip and flexion deformity of the knee. And is there any scars? You can see that there's an operative scar. You can tell there is approximately there is a lateral approach to the hip, that is healed scar there. And kyphosis, lordosis, attitude of the hip, knee, and ankle. Next, you examine the patient in supine position. What is the attitude of the hip, knee, and ankle? Whether it's externally rotated, internally rotated. Is there any increased lumbar lordosis from the side? Both the anterosuperior iliac spine, are there at the same level, or is there any, one side is at a lower level or a higher level? See both the greater trochanter here, whether they are at the position, or is there undue prominence of the greater trochanter? Carpus triangle, you can observe here, is there any fullness, any scar or sinus? And in the thigh, you can see is there any swelling. and position of the patella, whether at the same level or it is externally rotated abdominally somewhere or internally rotated, you can know from there. You can see the calf also for wasting, medial malleolus level and the direction, and what is the level of the heel. Next, you can go to the palpation. Remember, the first thing which you palpate is the warmth by the back of your hand. Then you look for the tenderness and look for the scars or sinuses. And the deep palpation, look for the tenderness and the lymph nodes. And some examiners have got a fancy of asking the lymph nodes. Remember, the lymph nodes around the inguinal region are in two groups, superficial group and the deep group. And the superficial group are three groups again. There is a superomedial superficial and superolateral superficial, and there is an inferior superficial group. And there is a deep group. Remember the hip joints, the anterior part of the hip joint drains to deep inguinal lymph nodes here. Okay, the anterior part of the hip joints. Whereas the medial and posterior part of the hip, they travel along the obturator vessels and drain into internal iliac nodes. So some examiner may ask you that whether you have palpated the inguinal lymph node, then you tell that, okay, I have palpated and it is not, whether it is the size is increased, it is matted, and whether it is hard, firm, or soft, all these things you have to tell about the lymph nodes. Then you confirm all the findings of the inspection. Next important point in your hip examination, the anterior hip joint line. Remember the hip joint, anterior hip joint line is about 2 to 3 centimeters below and lateral to mid-inguinal point. Here, most of the candidates, they fumble here. What is the difference between mid-inguinal point and midpoint of the inguinal ligament? Remember, this is the pubic symphysis, this is the pubic tubercle. Pubic tubercle remains lateral to the pubic symphysis. Okay, pubic tubercle remains lateral to pubic symphysis. And mid-inguinal point is the midpoint of the line joining the pubic symphysis to the anterosuperior spine. So this is the mid-inguinal point. Whereas the inguinal ligament, it is attached from the pubic tubercle to the anterosuperior spine. Okay, so the midpoint of the inguinal ligament is the midpoint between the pubic tubercle and anterosuperior spine. Since the pubic tubercle remains lateral to pubic symphysis, hence midpoint of the inguinal ligament remains lateral to mid-inguinal point. And our hip joint is described, hip joint line, it is below 2 to 3 centimeters below and lateral to the mid-inguinal point. Okay, that is the anterior joint line of the hip, and here you palpate the tenderness of the anterior hip joint line. And roughly, if you see that if you palpate the femoral artery, it remains lateral to the femoral artery landmark. So it is described as 2 to 3 centimeters below and lateral to mid-inguinal point, and mid-inguinal point is the center of the line joining the anterosuperior spine and symphysis pubis. It should be very clear. Now, the posterior joint line is usually not asked. You do not comment about posterior joint line, but if the examiner tends to ask you, then you just answer that it is the junction of a line joining the posterior superior iliac spine to the greater trochanter. And you divide this line in three parts. It is at a point at the junction of the medial 2/3 and lateral 1/3. That is the posterior joint line, but because of the thick muscle of gluteus maximus, usually you do not palpate posterior hip joint line. So where it is located? Located at the junction of the lateral 1/3 and medial 2/3 of a line joining the posterior superior iliac spine and the greater trochanter. Now, next, after palpating the anterior joint hip line, go in a particular order. You palpate both the anterior superior iliac spine, iliac crest, and posterior superior iliac spine. So you palpate and feel whether there is any thickening of the bone, whether there is any irregularity, or is there any, broadening, etc. You palpate the edges, margins, and contour. Next, you come down and palpate the greater trochanter and give pressure and see whether there is a bitrochanteric steady pressure to see is there any hip joint pathology. Usually, swelling is seen in suppurative arthritis in the children. You can see cold abscess in case of tuberculosis of the hip or tuberculosis of the spine. The abscess trickles down to the front and medial aspect of the greater trochanter along the femoral vessels. It may be posteriorly in the gluteal region or in the pelvis if there is a perforation of the acetabulum. Next, you come to the vascular sign of Narath. You have to palpate the femoral artery. The relationship, remember, van from medial to lateral side, vein, artery, and nerve. And vascular sign of Narath, it is positive when you are not able to palpate the artery or if there is a low volume of pulsation compared to the other side. Vascular sign of Narath is negative when you feel both the femoral pulsations equally, both sides. So remember, it is always confusing. So better to express that femoral pulses are bilateral symmetrically palpable. So do not comment about vascular sign of Narath, but if the examiner asks, vascular sign of Narath is negative, that means it is normal, that both sides femoral pulses are palpable. If it is positive, that means it is not palpable or there is feebly palpable or the volume is low. Next, we come to most important aspect of the hip examination, that is movements and measurements and special tests. So until now, inspection and palpation. Next, we come to the movements. What are the movements possible in the hip joint? Start with a flexion. Don't start with the abduction, adduction. First we want to hear from you is flexion, extension. Next, abduction, adduction, internal rotation and external rotation, and finally circumflexion. So in this particular order, you must answer the movements of the hip joint. So how much movements are possible? So remember, there are three planes, flexion and extension. These are sagittal plane movements. So what are the sagittal plane movements? Flexion and extension. Flexion normally possible until 90 degree in an extended knee and possible until 120 degree in a flexed knee. Okay, remember this. Extension normally is about 15 degrees. The coronal plane movements are abduction and adduction. Okay, coronal plane movements. So normally the abduction is possible about 40 degrees and adduction is possible until about 30 degrees. So when you do a adduction, normally your thigh crosses the opposite part of the middle third of the opposite thigh. That means adduction is normal. That is how it is assessed. The third plane is a vertical plane or transverse plane or axial plane. Remember, all three are same. Vertical plane or axial plane or transverse plane. In transverse plane or axial plane or vertical plane, the external rotation and internal rotation movements occur. And external rotation is possible until about 45 degrees and internal rotation possible until about 30 degrees. So these are the three planes of movement and these are the movements are possible in the hip joint. Hip joint is a ball and socket variety of synovial joint and hence all the movements are possible in the hip joint. In case of fixed deformities, your starting point of movement will be the degree of deformity. Here I have shown the starting point of movement is 0 because it is a normal hip. But in abnormal hip, when there is a fixed deformity, then your flexion deformity is 30 degrees, then your movement starts from 30 to 90 or 30 to 60, something like that. In that way, you express. Next important point is that whenever you express the movements, first you tell how much fixed deformity is present. Next, what is the further range of movement possible? Whether these movements are active or passive, whether the movements are associated with pain or not, and whether these movements are associated with crepitus or not. So this completes your movements. So in each movement, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, you have to tell these are the how you characterize the movements. Remember, the caution is that always whenever you show the movement, you have to stabilize the pelvis and always compare with the normal side. Whenever the examiner tells you that show me flexion, first you show on the normal side, then you show the abnormal side. Now let's come to the first movement, that is flexion. The amount of first fixed flexion deformity that you have to tell, and the amount of fixed flexion deformity is known by the Thomas test. So how you do Thomas test? So you see there is an increased lumbar lordosis because this is a movement of the sagittal plane, and hence when there is a fixed flexion deformity, it gets compensated by the sagittal plane movement of the spine. So what is the sagittal movement of the spine? It is increased lumbar lordosis. So it is compensated by increased lumbar lordosis, hence the hip joint appears to be flat here. Okay. So you have to obliterate this lumbar lordosis in order to expose the flexion deformity of the hip. Suppose here the left side hip is affected. So in order to obliterate the lumbar lordosis, you have to flex the normal hip. So you have to flex the normal hip till the lumbar lordosis is obliterated. So when the lumbar lordosis is obliterated, naturally the hip joint flexion deformity gets exposed and this thigh goes up. Okay. So when this thigh goes up, then you passively try to correct it till the lumbar lordosis again just appears. So you passively try to, correct the deformity till the lumbar lordosis just appears, because there is a possibility that the patient may be holding this thigh and going to do a correct the lumbar lordosis in an exaggerated manner. So in order to correctly know the amount of flexion deformity, you passively extend the hip till the lumbar lordosis just appears. When the lumbar lordosis just is appearing, that is the exact amount of flexion deformity which is present. And how that is measured? You measure that angle, that the angle of the thigh it makes with the horizontal line or with the bed. This is the amount of flexion deformity. Okay. So again, I'm telling you, you have flex the opposite limb. So you flex the opposite limb till the lumbar lordosis disappears. Next, you passively try to extend the affected hip till the lumbar lordosis just appears, and that is the exact amount of lumbar lordosis. It is measured by the angle where the axis of the thigh, long axis thigh, makes an angle with the horizontal or the surface of the bed. So you measure the fixed deformity. Next, you see that whether is there any active hip range of movements is present. Suppose 30 degree of flexion deformity is there. What is the active range of movement? So it may be possible until about 60 degrees. Next, you see that what is the further passive range of movements. You do it, and in a flexed hip you do it. So further passive range of movement may be possible. And always mention whether it is painful or painless, and whether it is associated with crepitus or not. So that completes your amount of flexion in the hip joint. Now remember, sometimes patient tries to drag the feet on the bed when you do. When you tell the patient that you do the flexion yourself, so they tend to drag the feet. When they drag the feet, it is not active flexion, because it is the patient is taking the help of the bed, surface of the bed. So it is passive flexion. The examiner tries to trick you asking this question. When both the hips are affected, how to know the amount of flexion deformity? You have to do one by one. Thomas test on right hip, then do the left hip by flexing the other hip. So gradually do one by one, so that will tell you that how much flexion deformity is present. Or else you can do, suppose there is a knee has got a flexion deformity as well. Then how will you know? You take the patient to the edge of the bed. You take to the edge of the bed, so knee deformity, it gets exposed. So now you can see how much of flexion deformity is present by doing a Thomas test by taking the patient to the edge of the bed. Okay. Now you can also see fixed flexion deformity in prone position, especially in children. You can do that. Not in case it is difficult to do in case of adults. So make the patient lie down and take to the edge of the bed. So from the horizontal amount of deformity or angle which makes the axis of the thigh, that is the amount of flexion deformity which is present, which is tested in the prone position. Now this is a picture which is I have taken it from Dr. Jayant Sharma's book. So you can know that how much is flexion contributed by iliopsoas and how much by the quadriceps. So you ask the patient to do an active SLR. So when you do an active SLR, when the passive patient does active SLR, that is the amount of flexion is done by the quadriceps. Whereas if you flex the knee, then amount of flexion is done by the purely by iliopsoas. That is the iliopsoas contribution. So you make the patient sit at the edge of the table, flex the knee and move it towards the chest without moving the opposite leg. When the patient sits, then that much amount of flexion is contributed by the iliopsoas. So quadriceps femoris as well as iliopsoas tendon, they do the flexion of the hip. Similarly, extension. So you make the patient lie down on the side lying position and see how much extension is possible from the neutral position, or else you can take the patient to the edge of the table and see that how much extension of the hip is possible. But if there is a fixed flexion deformity, remember extension is 0. That you have to tell always. Now in the prone lying position on the couch also you can see the extension. You have to immobilize the pelvis in one hand while you are examining the extension can extend the hip and see that how much angle it makes with the horizontal or the surface of the bed. Now, extension is also done by the hamstring. So how much is the hamstring contribution? How much is the gluteus maximus contribution? This picture is also taken from, Dr. Jain Sharma's book. So hamstring contribution in a knee extended position, if they extend the hip, that is the hamstring contribution. Whereas if you flex the knee and then extend the hip, then this is a gluteus maximus contribution for the extension of the hip. That is the trick that the examiner may ask, then you can answer that. Next, we come to the coronal plane movements. So coronal plane movements are abduction and adduction. So first, like you have to see in the fixed flexion deformity, you have to see that how much fixed adduction or abduction deformity is there in the hip joint. So how to know? If there is a fixed adduction deformity, then that side anterosuperior iliac spine goes up compared to the opposite side. So here, suppose the right side is affected, right side anterosuperior iliac spine has gone up. So what you need to do? You have to adduct further to bring the anterosuperior iliac spine to the same level. So this side has gone up, so you have to adduct further in order to bring both the anterosuperior iliac spine to the same level. And the amount of adduction you did in order to bring both the anterosuperior iliac spine to the same level is the amount of adduction deformity is the present. Here again, a important point that after you do the adduction, next further abductor limb little abduct the limb and check whether the pelvis is moving. So whenever you are moving and the pelvis starts moving, that is the exact amount of adduction deformity present. Like in the flexion deformity, I told you, you have to extend the hip little bit till the pelvis moves. Similarly, for abduction deformity, this is again adduction deformity on a patient. So you do a further adduction and see how much adduction you did, and that is the amount of adduction deformity. Whereas in abduction deformity, that side of anterosuperior iliac spine, it goes down compared to the opposite side. So in order to bring both the anterosuperior iliac spine to the same level, we have to abduct the limb further. You have to abduct the limb further in order to bring the anterosuperior iliac spine to the same level. Bringing the anterosuperior iliac spine to the same level is known as the squaring of the pelvis. Remember, so you are squaring the pelvis. So the amount of abduction you did is known as the amount of abduction deformity present in that limb. Again, to measure it accurately, so you have abducted the limb. Next, further adduct the limb a little bit and you see whether the pelvis is moving or not. If further adducting the limb, the pelvis moves, that is the point, and that is the exact amount of abduction deformity which the thigh makes an angle with the midline of the body. Okay, so this is the angle of abduction deformity. So further abduct. So in order to know how much abduction deformity is present, remember to always inspect from the top in order to know both the anterosuperior iliac spine has been brought to the same level or you have squared the pelvis. Because if you see from the side or from somewhere, then there is maybe parallax error. So always see it from the top. Now question is, sometimes it is asked, how will you measure the fixed coronal plane deformities without moving the hip? Suppose the hip is very painful and patient doesn't allow you. So you measure the Kothari's angle. How will you draw Kothari's angle? Draw a midline axis. Draw a line joining both the anterosuperior iliac spine. Next, you draw the perpendicular from the ipsilateral or affected side anterosuperior iliac spine to the midline axis of the body. So this is the amount of adduction or abduction deformity which is present. That is the Kothari's angle. So that you can do without moving the hip joint. You can measure the Kothari's angle. Now next we come to the vertical plane or transverse plane or axial plane deformity or movements, that is internal rotation and external rotation. So in a knee extended and hip extended position, you can measure the internal rotation by measuring that how much angle the foot is making with the vertical axis. Usually second toe is taken as the axis of the foot. So the angle it makes the second toe with the axis, vertical axis of the foot is the amount of internal rotation. You can measure it in flexed hip. You can able to flex the hip, you can measure it. That when you take the foot away, that means you internally rotate the hip. You take the foot away, how much angle it makes with the axis of the long axis of the body is the amount of internal rotation. Similarly, external rotation, this is the vertical axis of the vertical axis. So how much angle the second toe makes, or second toe, this axis is the amount of external rotation in the extended hip. And in flexed hip, you can measure also if you take the foot inside, that how much external rotation it makes with the line which is drawn parallel to the midline axis of the body. There are two important signs which usually asked in the examination, is a sectoral sign and axis deviation. Sectoral sign usually you find in avascular necrosis, because usually in avascular necrosis, the anterosuperior part of the head is involved. So the anterosuperior head is when it is involved, when the hip is flexed to 90 degrees, the limb goes into obligatory external rotation. Normally the hip usually goes in internal rotation, but if hip goes into external rotation, that is usually in avascular necrosis, the sectoral sign is positive. And the axis deviation is that on full flexion of the hip and knee, usually the knee points to the opposite shoulder, but the limb is directed to the ipsilateral shoulder, then there is axis deviation. This usually occurs in the slipped capital femoral epiphysis. Okay, so that is known as axis deviation. So this is known as sectoral sign and axis deviation. These are two important signs you must remember. You can tell whenever it is present. Now, rotations can also be checked while the patient in prone position, especially in children. You can check it when making the patient prone, how much internal rotation and external rotation is present. Now, sometimes you find exaggerated range of movement. Then don't get surprised, because in certain conditions you get exaggeration of range of movement. The exaggeration occurs in all the directions. If there's an excision of the hip, that means more than abduction, adduction, rotations may be possible. A patient has a childhood septic arthritis, so there is completely head is observed like Townsend's arthritis. Sometimes in dysplastic hips, in the head is dislocated, you find exaggerated range of movement in certain directions. Post-polio residual paralysis, suppose there is, due to muscle weakness, you may find exaggerated movements. Whereas in slipped capital femoral epiphysis, you find exaggerated extension, adduction, and external rotation. So in particular direction, you find exaggerated movements in slipped capital femoral epiphysis, and you will get limited movements in the opposite direction. Next, we come to measurements. Okay, so measurements, muscle wasting, limb length discrepancy, Brand's, Nelaton's line, Shoemaker's line, all these things you will see in measurements. Out of which most important thing, the limb length discrepancy, where most of the candidates they fumble here. Muscle wasting is not much difficult. That take a fixed bony landmark, either a joint line or a tibial tuberosity, and make a fixed measurement, fixed length on either side. Usually 6 inches is taken, but you can take more also. So mark there and measure the girth of the limb there and compare with the opposite side. Why it is taken 6 inches? Because sometimes this question is asked. So remember, phylogenetically, the vastus medialis, out of the quadriceps muscle, the vastus medialis, it appears last and disappears fast. So whenever there is a wasting, first the vastus medialis disappears. So the earliest amount of wasting which is measured is, vastus medialis goes up. And at about 6 inches from the joint line, the vastus medialis is more prominent, and that is why it is first appears, the wasting appears at this point. That's why usually it is taken as a 6 inches in a case of adult patients. Now in limb length discrepancy, you measure the two things, that is apparent length and true length. Remember, apparent length, the both limbs should be parallel in line with the trunk, and it is measured from a fixed point in the midline, usually fixed by bony landmark like the Giphisternum or Manubrium sterni. And some books have written umbilicus. Better not to take the umbilicus because it is a soft tissue landmark. So take from the Giphisternum to the tip of the medial malleus when the limbs are parallel or lying in identical position. In the both limbs are parallel with the trunk. So that is how you apparent length is measured. Whereas true length, the pelvis should be squared first. So if there is a coronal plane deformity, first you square the pelvis, like by abducting or adducting the limb, and both limbs should be in identical position. That means if there is a abduction deformity, so the opposite hip, keep it in equal amount of abduction. And if there is adduction deformity, then keep the opposite limb in equal amount of adduction and take the measurement. Next important thing, suppose there is a flexion deformity in the knee, keep the opposite limb also in the equal amount of knee flexion when you take the true length. Okay, that is important how you take the true length, and it is measured from the anterosuperior spine to the tip of the medial malleolus, keeping both the limbs in identical position. Now, these next two slides are extremely important, remember. So you measure apparent length and true length. Now remember, true lengthening is very rare. It occurs very rarely, and if there is a old unreduced anterior dislocation of the hip, then there may be a true lengthening. Or there's a huge osteophytes are there in the medial side of acetabulum, then there's a true lengthening. So usually in the examination, you don't get a case where there is a true lengthening is there. So in most of the cases, there is a true shortening. So you'll find there must be some amount of true shortening is there when you compare both the sides. But there will be apparent lengthening and apparent shortening when you measure the apparent length. When the apparent length is equal to true length, that means there is no deformity. Okay, so there is no coronal plane deformity, abduction or adduction deformity. But when there is a apparent lengthening, okay, apparent lengthening, that means there is a abduction deformity which is associated, correct? But when there is apparent shortening, remember there is usually adduction deformity, but there is a possibility of abduction deformity as well, abduction deformity associated. Okay, that in the next slide I will clarify. But one rough estimation is that every 10 degree of deformity, there will be roughly 1 centimeter lengthening or shortening. Okay, so that calculation you have to do in mind. Now, when there is a adduction deformity, remember the true shortening gets exaggerated by the deformity. Hence, the amount of apparent shortening is always more than the true shortening. So true shortening may be 2 centimeters, whereas apparent shortening will be 3 centimeters. So there is a adduction deformity of about 10 degree because there is a 1 centimeter of increased apparent shortening, and that is after compensation is there. So there is a 10 degree of adduction deformity. So difference is 1 centimeter. Okay, that is clear. But in abduction deformity, what happens? The true shortening first gets compensated by the deformity, and here the amount of apparent shortening is less than the true shortening. Okay, here the candidate gets fumbled. So true shortening may be 3 centimeter, apparent shortening may be 2 centimeters. So here the candidate gets fumbled. So true shortening is more than the apparent shortening. But there is a possibility again, true shortening more than the apparent lengthening. Okay, so apparent lengthening, abduction deformity, so apparent lengthening suppose 2 centimeters, true shortening may be 3 centimeters. Okay, so there's 10 degree of abduction deformity. So that is the important point, that whenever you will find true shortening in most of the cases. If the apparent shortening is more than the true shortening, it is adduction deformity for sure. But the apparent shortening is less than the true shortening, or apparent lengthening, how much you have measured, less than the true shortening, it is abduction deformity. Okay, so that you must remember and see in multiple cases. You must remember this and express in your examination. For every centimeter, there may be 10 degree of deformity which is associated. Next, you must know that whether the shortening, whether it is supra-trochanteric or infra-trochanteric, whether it is associated with the hip joint or pathology is above the hip joint or below the hip joint. So for doing a measurement of Brand triangles, remember the pelvis should be squared first. Okay, pelvis should be squat side, and both the lower limbs should be again kept in identical position in order to measure the Brandt's triangle. And always compare the both sides. And usually in unilateral hip pathology, Brandt's triangle helpful, but it is not helpful in bilateral pathology because you have to compare with the normal side. So you draw a line joining both anterosuperior spine and the tip of the greater trochanter. This is the first line. The second line, you draw a line in a vertical on the horizontal, that is perpendicular to the horizontal, and you measure the distance from the tip of the greater trochanter to this second line. The vertical distance or perpendicular distance you measure and compare with the opposite side. If there is a shortening is there, then you tell that how much shortening is there. There may be 2 centimeter shortening, which is supratrochanteric. There may be 2 centimeter shortening, out of which 1 centimeter may be supratrochanteric. Like this, you express. Supratrochanteric means that's a hip joint pathology. So if it is not supratrochanteric, that means it is below trochanter. That means pathology may be, on the femoral side, there may be shortening of the femur due to malunited subtrochanteric fracture, malunited fracture femur, or shortening of the tibia, blah, blah, whatever it may be possible. So hip joint pathology, usually supratrochanteric shortening. Now next is the Nellton's line. Remember, Nellton's line is drawn a line drawing the anterosuperior spine to the ischial tuberosity joint line. Usually tip of the greater trochanter, it touches the line or remains below. But if it goes above this line, then there is a supratrochanteric shortening. Okay, supratrochanteric shortening. And in bilateral hip pathologies, Nellton's lines will be useful because it goes beyond the inner line. The trochanter goes above the line. Remember, the position of the leg is not important in Nellton's line because it moves through an arc of the motion. So whether 30 degree, 90 degree, next, in bilateral hip pathology, Shoemaker's line is also, gives you an idea about whether that is supratrochanteric shortening. Normally, if you join the tip of the greater trochanter to the tip of the anterosuperior iliac spine and extend this line on both lines, the lines meet at or above the umbilicus normally. Okay. If the bilaterally this trochanter has gone up, then both the lines will meet at the center near or below the umbilicus. But if there's a unilateral pathology or there's an upward migration of the trochanter, then the lines will meet at the opposite side below the level of the umbilicus. That means if this trochanter has gone up, then both the lines will meet on the opposite side, on the right side, below the umbilicus. Okay. So that is how to interpretation of the Shoemaker lines. Of course, nowadays the examiners do not ask in detail, but if they ask you how you know bilateral hip pathology, then you tell Nellton's lines or Shoemaker's lines. Next, Chinese line. Chinese line is normally the lines are parallel when you join both the anterosuperior iliac spine and both the tip of the trochanter. But if that one trochanter has gone up proximally, then both the lines either will converge or diverge. That is Chinese line. Now, Morris bitrochanteric line, now there's not much in use, but you must know line can be shorter if there's a protrusion. What you do, you draw the midline and draw a line from the greater trochanter, tip of the greater trochanter to this line. Normally, you put 2 cardboards on either side and draw these lines and put 2 cardboards, or you can put 2 books also. And if there's any side there is protrusion, that side line will be shorter compared to the opposite side. Next, you come to the special test. The last is the special test, like Trendelenburg test, telescoping test, Alice or Galeazzi test, Ottolini, and a Barlow's test, Faber or Sadi test. These are again extremely important. Let's come to the Trendelenburg test. Remember that whenever the person stands on one leg, that means he's standing on the right leg and left leg is taking up, this side of pelvis will go up. That is because of the contraction of the abductors which are attached there from the pelvis to the greater trochanter. Because these abductors, they contract, they pull the pelvis downwards, so this side of pelvis goes up. Okay, that is a normal abductor mechanism. And this movement takes place at the fulcrum, that is the hip joint. Okay, The fulcrum is the hip joint. The lever arm is the neck of the femur and the trochanter. And the force here, the muscle here is the abductors, which pull the pelvis down, and this side of pelvis goes up. So iliac crest is raised up, leg remains elevated in relation to the contralateral side. That means Trendelenburg test is negative. So instead, if this side of pelvis remains at the same level or goes down, that means the Trendelenburg test is positive. That means this side abductor mechanism is poor. Either the muscle is not contracting, or there's a poor contraction of the muscle, weakness of the muscle, or the lever arm is poor, there's a fracture or non-union or something like that, or there is a problem in the fulcrum or the hip joint is dislocated or something like that. So that is a positive Trendelenburg test. Remember, this is known as compensated Trendelenburg test, when the patient tilts the upper trunk significantly in order to maintain an upright posture, which is a compensatory mechanism to help the patient maintain his or her balance. So he is tilting significantly in order to maintain that position. That is a compensated Trendelenburg test. Remember, Trendelenburg test should not be performed if there is associated coronal plane deformity. That means fixed abduction or adduction deformity. Do not do the Trendelenburg test. If there is flexion deformity of the hip more than 30 degrees, if the patient is unable to stand unsupported for about 30 seconds, or any painful hip, that means patient will not be able to stand unsupported for 30 seconds, then tell that, sir, I could not perform the Trendelenburg test. So positive Trendelenburg test, as I told you, it shows that abductor mechanism poor, that may be problem in the fulcrum, maybe in the lever arm, or in the force, that is weakness of abductor, that you can answer. Now this is telescoping test. So what you do, you flex the hip and the knee, and then you do a push and the pull. Okay. So remember, you keep the leg supported on your forearm here, and you put your opposite hand and palpate the tip of the greater trochanter. So if the greater trochanter moves, that means telescoping test is positive. If it doesn't move, then it is negative. Always compare with the opposite side. This is Allis or Gallagher test. Sometimes the examiner tends to ask in which position you have to test. You look from the front, it will show you there is a shortening of the tibia if there is a disparity there. If you see from the side, if there is a disparity, there is a shortening of the femur. Okay. So from the front, it is shortening of the tibia. From the side, it is shortening of the femur. Now this is Ottolani and Barlow's test, which has been described for dislocation or congenital hip dislocation, CDH cases usually. So Barlow is a clunk of exit. That means you adduct the limb and keep pressure. That means the hip will go out. That is a clunk of exit. You will hear the clunk. So this is usually remembered. Barlow means Baharlow. That means you are taking the hip out. Ottolani is a clunk of entry. You abduct, flex and abduct the hip comes in with a clunk of entry. So Ottolani means underlani, Ottolani. So remember this way, Baharlow and underlani, Barlow's and Ottolani test, usually done in the congenital dislocation of the hip or CDH cases in case of children. This is known as Faber's test, flexion, abduction and external rotation, FABER, other than Patrick's test. So you do a flexion, abduction, external rotation. If it remains positive, if the knee remains above the straight leg. If it is above, that means Faber's test is positive. So it is positive when the hip joint is affected, there's a iliopsoas spasm or sacroiliac joint dysfunction. In those cases, Faber's test becomes positive. The other test is known as the Faddy's test, or flexion, adduction, and internal rotation. So it is usually positive in case of piriformis syndrome, or sometimes in the impingement also. In there is a impingement test in case of femoroacetabular impingement. This Faddy's test becomes positive: flexion, adduction, and internal rotation. Next, we examine the gait. Gait is altogether it is a separate lecture. Antalgic gait, or the Trendelenburg test, waddling gait, short-legged gait, high-stepping gait, in-toeing or out-toeing gait. Two most important gaits is the antalgic gait. And remember, antalgic gait usually indicates there is a painful hip. Patient has got a certain stance phase. Quickly it takes the lift the foot after putting on the floor. That is a certain stance phase. and patient usually leans over the affected side in order to avoid the painful contraction of the hip abductors, so antalgic gait. Whereas Trendelenburg is opposite, it indicates weakness of the abductors. So during the stance phase of the affected side, the contralateral pelvis dips down as you do a, Trendelenburg test. He leans to the unaffected side because of weakness of abductors. It doesn't contract, so he leans to the opposite side. If bilateral, this produces a waddling gait. So you tell there is a waddling gait is present. So do not forget to examine the spine and sacroiliac joints and both the knees also quickly have a examination. So there may be associated pathology. Sometimes the examiner asks that how you test the SI joints without moving the hip joint. So you tell compression and distraction test or Genslen's test. Genslen's test, you take the patient to the side of the bed and extend the hip, that is Genslen's test. So sacroiliac joint pathology can be examined without moving the hip. For rectal examination, sometimes the examiner may ask, but normally we don't do it, but it is important in cases of protrusio or earlier what we told that central dislocation of the hip. Now, after you complete your examination, you have to give a clinical diagnosis or what you tell is a pathological diagnosis. Whether there is a synovitis, there is a arthritis, there is an unstable hip, there is a coxa vara, there is a protrusio, or there is a ankylosis. So depending upon your findings, you have to give a pathological diagnosis. And after you give pathological diagnosis, then you can give a etiological diagnosis. That means it may be due to synovitis, due to what, rheumatoid, or due to avascular necrosis. That you can give a etiological diagnosis depending upon your history and findings. So when you tell is a synovitis, usually the attitude of the hip is in flexion and abduction, and sometimes external rotation. Flexion, abduction, and external rotation is the attitude of the hip, and there may be apparent lengthening associated. Usually, the range of movement is full and terminally restricted. Only extremes are painful. So there is a stage of synovitis. Whereas arthritis, there will be joint line tenderness must be there. There must be some associated fixed deformities, fixed flexion deformity, fixed abduction or adduction deformity. So usually it is a flexed and adducted hip, flexion or adduction. And range of movements are restricted in all the direction and attempted movements are painful. So painful restricted movements is usually arthritis. Okay. Next, what is the unstable hip? So in unstable hip, there will be exaggerated range of movement. That means hip is dislocated or subluxated. So there will be some directions, there will be exaggerated range of movement. Trendelenburg test will be positive, telescoping test will be positive, and patient may have a Trendelenburg gait. Okay. Trendelenburg test positive, usually patient will have a Trendelenburg gait. So this shows there is an unstable hip. So you tell that unstable hip due to a pathological hip dislocation or pathological hip subluxation or old unreduced dislocated hip, unstable hip. Coxa vara is an important thing that you must remember. Sometimes, due to malunited fracture trochanter, malunited subtrochanteric fractures, malunited, maybe fracture neck femur. So there may be coxa vara. So usually patient presents with a adduction deformity. There will be restriction of abduction and internal rotation, whereas there may be exaggerated adduction and external rotation. There will be true supratrochanteric shortening and Trendelenburg test will be positive. So you tell clinically is a patient coxa vara due to etiological diagnosis, malunited intertrochanteric fracture, malunited subtrochanteric fracture. So that you tell this a coxa vara is a clinical diagnosis. Protrusio, maybe in rheumatoids, unidirectional movements will be there. That means flexion and extension will be there, whereas the rotations will be restricted. Abduction, adduction will be restricted. So unidirectional movements, only flexion, extension may be possible. That means hip has gone inside. Protrusio may be due to rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, it may be post-traumatic. Maybe history of trauma is there, significant trauma, but protrusio is there. So Morris bitrochanteric test will be positive, and you may mention that you may not have done, but you may mention that I'll do a proper rectal examination in order to know whether there is a protrusio. Next, ankylosis. Okay, no, complete restriction of movements in all the direction is known as ankylosis. There are two types of ankylosis. Remember, fibrous ankylosis and bony ankylosis. In fibrous ankylosing, there will be a jog of movement will be possible, and any attempted movements will be painful. Whereas bony ankylosing, there will be absolutely no movements possible, and attempted movements will be painless. So fibrous ankylosing usually end result of a tuberculosis infection, whereas bony ankylosing is end result of any pyogenic infection. Okay, so you can tell clinically it looks like there's ankylosis of the hip, and next you can tell clinically whether it's a sound ankylosis or an unsound ankylosis. Sound ankylosis means in some position like say about 10 to 20 degree of hip abduction, and about 5 to 10 degree hip flexion without any rotational deformity. You tell sound ankylosing. That means patient will be able to do his day-to-day activities with this ankylosing. Unsound, if it is not acceptable to the patient, is unable to do day-to-day activities. So finally, to conclude, take-home message: you have to take a careful history. Extremely important, take a history properly, because you forget to take a detailed history, because history will give you 50% of diagnosis. Next, to do a meticulous examination in order, starting from inspection, palpation, movements, measurements, facial tests, and finally SI joint, spine, and the knee examination. The basic test which is important is a Thomas test: how to square the pelvis, how to measure the apparent length and true length, and how to interpret it in case of your coronal plane deformities. How to do special test, Trendelenburg test, and telescoping test. You must examine the spine and SI joints in associated spine and SI joint test. Next, finally, you have to give a summary with a provisional diagnosis, and in the diagnosis, you have to give a pathological diagnosis based on your findings, and you predict the etiological diagnosis, most likely due to rheumatoid arthritis, most likely due to avascular necrosis, most likely due to malunited intertrochanteric fractures, most likely due to a non-union of transorbital fracture femur. Like this you have to give. Okay, that completes your hip joint examination on how to approach a case of hip. Is there any questions? Then I can take it there. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, sir. There are a few questions. I think should we take questions from students first, or senior faculty's comments, sir? Mohanty, sir.
Anything, whatever is okay for me.
Okay, sir. Sir, we will take senior faculty's comments first, and then we will finish the students' questions. Gopa Kumar, sir.
I think he has covered almost everything. What the student needs to know when he is faced with a hip joint problem. I want to ask you the sectoral sign. Some people call the differential limitation movement as the sectoral sign. For example, usually if you in extension, the rotations will be less. When you flex it, there will be slight increase in rotations. And this may be altered in cases of when there is a mechanical problem with the hip, like a deformed head or a coxa magna. Some people call this as the sectoral sign. But you are saying that in 90-degree obligatory external rotation is the sectoral sign. I just wanted to get your clarification.
Usually, sectoral sign is described with respect to avascular necrosis. So we don't tell in case of suppose coxa magna and differential rotation. There we express it as a differential rotation rather than telling it is a sectoral sign. So if you are taking a diagnosis towards avascular necrosis, then it is better to interpret that it's a sectoral sign is positive. Whereas in other conditions, we tell it's a differential rotation is there.
Kakatkar, sir. Kakatkar, sir.
I think it was a very comprehensive talk and very beautifully explained almost each and everything. Students always confused amongst the adduction and abduction deformities. And there are some questions, I think we can always sort it out. And as Gopakumar sir was saying, the differential rotation and sectoral signs both are almost, I think, identical. It depends on the pathology that you are telling. The rotations in extension and rotations in flexion of the hip, if they are different, then you call it as a sectoral sign or you call it as a differential rotation. So I think they are almost synonymous to me.
Shivananda sir. Uday Kumar sir.
Just a little bit clarification regarding the sectoral sign. Normally, I'm just contradicting some clarification from the Gopakumar sir also. In extension, usually they are normal, they are better, maybe in sectoral sign. In extension, they are almost better, but when it's flexed, they are limited. In flexed, they are limited. That is, we understand what the differential restriction of movements, and that also we call it sectoral sign. So, little bit clarification from the Gopakumar sir and Mahanti sir.
Yeah, means in extension, usually it's possible when you flex that it is restricted.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So that is what is usually it is there.
That is what we understand, that the head is
So we
deformed.
tell it is a differential rotation. And if there is a confusion between sectoral sign and differential rotation, it's better to, I think, better to tell that express it as a differential rotation, which is very clear that in sectoral sign only it is a description which is given in avascular necrosis.
Gopakumar sir.
Yeah, it is almost the same because of the in extension, what is happening in the normal hip anteriorly, there is the ligament of Bigelow, which restrict the rotation to some extent. Once you flex the hip, this ligament is relaxed and there will be slightly more rotations. Okay. In a pathology of the hip joint where there is a mechanical alteration in the head of the femur, usually the first movement to go is the internal rotation. Therefore, in extension, there may be more movement compared to that of flexion. Because once you flex the hip, the deformed part may articulate with the acetabulum and it restricts the movement of the hip joint. So there are several conditions that produce a differential limitation of movement, and one of them is the avascular necrosis. And as Mohanty sir said, you use the term sectoral sign mainly in cases of avascular necrosis of the femoral head.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I have already said what I have.
Right, sir. Mohanty sir, how to interpret rotational deformity in supine position? As in normally supine position, there is a 15 degrees of external rotation.
Yeah, normal attitude of the limb, when you describe the attitude of the limb, you describe it is normal attitude of the limb 15 degree of external rotation. But that 15 degree of external rotation may be a fixed external rotation. So you internally rotate the limb, okay, and you see that how much internal rotation is possible. See, from the neutral, you have to describe the movements. That means you keep the limb in neutral position, in the vertical position, and from there, how much internal rotation is possible, you measure and tell, and how much external rotation is possible. This 15 degree external rotation is a normal attitude of the limb. This you don't describe as the range of movement. Range of movement is this 15 degree. How this 15 degree has come? It is because it is 15 degrees from the vertical axis, that is the second toe axis, when you keep the leg in neutral position. So you interpret that from the neutral position, that 20 degree of internal rotation possible, then 30 degree of external rotation possible. Do never ever describe that beyond this 15 degree or in relation to this 15 degree of external rotation.
Sir, where do we keep goniometer while measuring rotations in extension?
I showed you that you have to keep the leg in neutral rotation keep one limb of the goniometer with the axis as the second toe, taking second toe is the axis. Next to measure that how much is internally or from the vertical line. From one limb of the goniometer is in the vertical line, one limb of the goniometer is in the second toe.
Sir, this question is to Gopakumar sir and you. Student says ki last time Gopakumar sir explained during our classes that it is not compulsory for a patient to be able to stand unsupported for 30 seconds for Trendelenburg.
Yeah, that
And
is the assist Trendelenburg.
Then assisted
So if the-
Trendelenburg, yeah, sir can explain, yeah.
Sir,
Yeah, only thing is if the patient is not able to stand for more than 30 seconds, to ask the patient to support their hand in your palm. Okay. So when they raise the affected side, what is happening is more pressure will be on the ipsilateral side,
right, sir.
ipsilateral hand.
Right, sir. Mohanty sir, will you please explain again the concept of differential rotations? What do we understand by differential rotations? Mohanty sir.
Yeah. Whenever you can check the rotations in the hip joint, both keeping the leg in extension and keeping the hip in flexion. So in extended hip, when you measure the rotations, internal rotation and external rotation, and when you keep the hip flexed, measure the internal rotation and external rotation, then you see there is a difference in the rotations possible. Then you tell this is known as differential rotation. That means the amount of rotation is different in different position of the hip joint. That is not differential rotation.
Is coronal plane basically rotations?
Sorry?
Coronal plane rotations in different positions of hip.
No. Rotations
axial.
occur in the transverse plane. Rotations
Right, sir.
occur in the
Axial.
transverse plane. Yeah, axial plane.
Right.
But
Right,
whether
sir.
the hip is extended or hip is flexed, in that position it is known as differential rotation. It may be same, it may be same. That Gopakumar sir told that because ligament bigelow is there, that restricts the rotation normally in extended position, and when you flex the ligament of bigelow becomes relaxed, so there is a little increased amount of internal rotation possible.
Right.
Sir, my question to the Gopakumar sir and Mohanty sir, differential abduction in extension and in flexion of the hip joint.
Yeah, that is significant mainly in cerebral palsy. For example, if the hip is flexed and the abduction, you measure the range of abduction,
Yes,
and
sir.
you keep the hip extended and measure the range of abduction. If the restriction of abduction is both in flexion and extension, that means that it is the adductors that are more involved. And if it flexion, more abduction is there, and in extension it is reduced. And further on flexing the knee, if it increases, that means that it is mainly the medial hamstrings, especially the gracilis that is in. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
I think you got it, yeah. So mainly it is the modified Phelps test that
Modified
you
Phelps.
measure the rate of action in extension of the hip and extension of the knee, and then you flex the knee and measure the range of abduction. If in flexion of the knee the abduction increases, that is the gracilis that is affected. It is the flexion of the knee joint. Similarly, if the hip flexion and extension, if there is restriction of abduction, that means the adductor that is involved. So if on flexion, the abduction increases, that means that it is the medial hamstring that is involved.
Yes, sir.
I think there are no questions in the chat box, sir. I will take the comments from other faculties. Kanojia, sir.
Very extensively and comprehensive both, and from examination point of view he has stressed in every point that this may be asked and that may be asked. So I think this is a complete presentation, and the students should go and read again. That will make it complete.
All right, sir. Thank you, sir.
Exactly that. Today you must, tonight you must read HIP examination from your ESDAS book and understand, try to understand each and every line of it. Next, whenever you examine the patients and write down those findings on a paper, whatever HIP, and in that order. Look to your book and write down in that particular order. If you do 5 HIP examinations and write down everything looking at your book, then you'll remember everything. And from next time onwards, you don't have to see the book. You will automatically, you'll remember everything. That is the thing.
All right, sir.
I
Shivananda,
got
sir.
one.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Gopakumar, sir, please.
I think as in last time, you can, if Mohanty sir agrees, you can keep it in the web for 48 hours so that the students can again do that.
All right,
The
sir. I will
link-
discuss. Yes, sir. I will discuss with him because he is Mohanty sir should be sure regarding the identity of the patient. Last time also I consulted him and he edited the talk and then he allowed. But if he agrees, then we will do that, sir.
Yeah,
Even-
I'll just go through it whether any patient
right, sir.
face is visible. Yes, sir.
Whatever
yeah.
is there, I will just make it and share that link with you, sir. If you feel everything is fine, then tell me, then only I will do this. Right, sir. We'll do that, sir. Thank you, sir.
Uday Kumar sir,
Sir,
Yes,
sir,
I tell every student of my college or any college for a general advice to every PC, because this is a regular case and most of the times, 90% times they will keep a HIP case. So I advise everyone to write his own HIP case sheet. But at least for institution, what is the modality they follow? This is the standard modality. Everybody can, this is a universal model. The SAR has given a universal model. There should not be any controversies. There are no controversies at any stage of the discussion. So I advise everyone to note down each and every point. Once if anybody, I have taken many screenshots during the lecture. Suppose anybody misses it also, you can note down each and every point, and this will be more than sufficient for your examination. But I advise everyone to have a HIP case sheet on your desktop. As and when you want to have to refer to it. That is what my comment, sir. Thank you, sir, Mohanty, sir.
right, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Mahalis-
I'll just tell one important point which I used to do during my post-graduation. When I was doing, MS orthopedics, every OPD day, whatever patients got admitted, in the evening, I used to come to the ward. After taking ward rounds, then I take the patient to a side room or examination room. There I sit, take my ESDAS book, take the indoor case sheet where the registrar's notes or whatever to be put, and write down everything about that patient after examining. But it be foot case, ankle case, or whatever, hip case, knee case, whatever. Look at the book and write down everything, all the findings. That way I remembered everything. So that after you examine 4-5 cases, then you'll remember everything. You will automatically write down everything. If there's any doubt, ask your teachers. They will guide you next day. There's one more question during Tendelmar test. I will ask the patient to stand on the affected side. Yes, you have to ask the patient. First, you ask the patient to stand on the normal side to see, and then you tell the patient to ask on the affected side. One more, rotation measurements in extension before this can need to rule out internal torsion of the tibia and deformity in ankle and the leg. Kindly explain, sir. Internal torsion of course, those are those are complex things. You don't go into the complexity. There may be associated internal torsion and external torsion, whatever, those are the complex things. Right now, we don't go into those things. Those are associated problems,
Yes,
which will give rise to, again.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sir, I want one clarification from you, sir. 400 ml per week alcohol intake. So, is it whiskey, rum, beer, sir? Because
For how many years, sir? For how many years? Sir?
10 years.
that-
10 years.
Sir, why I asked this question? Because it is the amount of liquor in grams.
Percentage of alcohol.
Percentage. Because
Percentage.
6%, 8%. Person like me who doesn't drink even beer will be lost. And because as an ex-serviceman, my quota is, sir, almost you can say 40 bottles of beer per month or 10 bottles of rum or whiskey. But for exam to answer, it should be in grams or percentage. So for that clarification, I just want from you, sir. No other reason to ask this question.
Frankly speaking, there is an article actually about this. I right now I don't remember. I cannot tell you what kind of alcohol. It was written that the relative risk of avascular necrosis increases 9.2-fold or 9.4-fold if the person takes alcohol 400 ml per week for about 10 years compared to less than 400 ml for 10 years. So
Right.
relative risk increases considerably. The relative risk is less than 2 point something, and here more than 9.2 or something like that. But I don't remember now whether it is a whiskey or rum.
Even there is some safe dose also, sir. Beyond which in male it is different, in female it is different. Is altogether a different topic. I think Uday Kumar sir is knowing and he wants to comment. Yes, sir.
No, sir, I'm not I don't drink regularly, but I'm not a teetotaler also. I drink very occasionally, sir.
Sir,
But
sir.
my question to entire panel, so recently one of my orthopedic friend's son diagnosed bilateral avian, sir. Otherwise, hale and healthy, nothing was there. But he had COVID last year. Last year had COVID and took steroids for nearly 3 to 4 weeks. That is also methylprednisolone, 16 milligrams BD for 1 week, 8 milligrams BD for 1 week, and then 4, and then that was tapered. Maybe 4 weeks, you can say. Last 2 months, 3 months back, you were diagnosed to having bilateral avian hip, sir. Because it's a
Sir.
short duration, is there any possibility of this one or some?
Both idiosyncratic effect and cumulative effect. Both things are possible for steroids. Even a short course of steroid for as low as 48 milligram of prednisolone per week has shown to development of AVN. And cumulative effect also. For prolonged intake of steroids also cumulative. So both the effects are there in steroids, there. How long, after how many days they will develop? Anytime 2 years. Within 2 years, they may develop that is the time period which is given in the literature. So within 2 years, they can develop. And we are seeing many patients are after this COVID. They have been treated as young patients are coming with avascular necrosis. So it is going to be, a shower of post-steroid avian after this COVID.
See, this may be because of post-steroid or there is a thrombotic phenomena in the post-covidic. So there may be also some vascular injury also in COVID.
Yeah. There is a
Because it
possibility.
has been found.
Mahale
There is a
sir.
possibility.
Mahale sir. Sir was there, I think. Mahale sir, if you
Yes,
are
sir.
there, please unmute.
That is why in COVID they give all this heparin
Aspirin and
treatment
everything.
yeah. Aspirin
Uh,
treatment.
sir,
Aspirin.
Sir, question to all faculties. Even a single dose of steroid of 1 gram, single dose, is it possible to have AVN?
No, sir. Literature
Not
has shown-
in my opinion.
Right, sir. No, literature wise, is there any evidence? A single dose, heavy dose
single
of
dose
1 gram.
1 gram. It has they have shown 48 milligram per day for over a week. That is the shortest steroid which has given rise to. So 48 milligram over a week, then you can calculate 1 gram can cause also. I don't know. 48
Because
milligrams per day for 7 days, prednisolone.
I am not actually exactly remembering, but I have heard in one of the conferences from one senior faculty that even a single dose of steroid can cause. And for our guidelines, while doing the those patients who are on low dose steroids, and when we are going for the arthroplasty, hip arthroplasty or knee arthroplasty, we should be careful if dose is exceeding 7.5 milligram per day more than 7 days, then we should expect this adrenal storm. That is what literature mentions. So opinion from the senior faculty, sir, Kakatkar sir, Gopakumar sir, regarding single heavy dose and effect is avian.
Well, as as Dr. Mohanty said, if it is idiosyncrasy as a mechanism to cause AVN, even one single dose of 1 gram can cause the AVN. And if it's a cumulative effect, then you need it for a prolonged time. Like we have seen in number of patients of some allergic conditions, allergic asthma, who are on prolonged steroids, they get the cumulative effect. But then some of them who get one single shot, they can get because of the idiosyncrasy.
Thank you, sir. Gopakumar sir.
The same. Theoretically, it can produce, but practically, I have not read any of the reports regarding this. Single dose
Yes.
produced.
Gopalji, what is the question?
It is like, rifampicin, people used to think that rifampicin causes hepatotoxicity. It is not the amount of rifampicin that you take which causes hepatotoxicity. It is number of times the idiosyncrasy to rifampicin, because of which just 1 or 2 doses also the patients can develop hepatotoxicity. I think similar mechanism works in steroids also.
Right, sir. Shivananda sir.
Gopalji, what is that question? Just 7.2 milligrams or something.
Sir, that was not the question. The question was, if 1 gram of steroid is given only once, single dose, is there possibility of developing AVN? Yes or no, sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sir. And
Yes, sir.
regarding that 7.5 milligram steroid per day for more than 7 days, and if such a patient you are taking for arthroplasty, say hip arthroplasty, then you will have to give heavy dose, 100 milligram loading dose at the time of surgery, and then gradually you have to taper, and you should be watchful for the adrenal storm. That's what I was just discussing, because I have came across with one such case, and patient was really not maintaining the blood pressure and properly followed the book guidelines. There was no clue for 48 hours despite gradually tapering. And then we just say, we will again go back to the full dose, and within 4 hours patient recovered, and then very prolonged. But patient was taking for few years and more than 15 milligram per day from Bombay's one surgeon. More than almost 4 or 5 years, patient was taking these low dose steroids.
Gopal,
Sir,
I think if the patient takes for only 1 week, there are no chances of the patient going into adrenal crisis.
Right.
If the treatment is going on for a long time, then only I think the patient can go in adrenal crisis.
yes, sir. But when
That
I came,
7.2 milligrams is for the to suppression of the hypothalamic pituitary axis. That is the thing that always you have to maintain less than that level to avoid that the cutoff of the hypothalamic pituitary axis. That is the reason why they are maintaining the 7.2 milligrams. So if it is
Sir,
more than that dose, then it is likely to shut down that hypothalamic pituitary axis. That is the reason why, that is the baseline.
because sir, I came across with one such case, and their guidelines were there. When you have to be large doses and then gradually taper, is that limit is 7.5 milligram per day, more than 7 days. If patient has taken, then you have to be vigilant for this complication. I think
Recently, I have operated one patient. I did not taper itself. I tapered after he was discharged
right, sir, right, sir.
because we did not take risk.
There are a
Right.
He
couple
was
of
taking for
questions.
10 years.
Sir.
couple of questions in the chat box. Range of motion should be first told active and passive. First you tell active, then passive. For example, there is a say 20 degree of fixed flexion deformity. Further, active range of movements are until 60 degree, and passive range of movements is until 90 degree, which is painful. Like that you can describe.
The
Next,
second question is
sir, in bone-
regard. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Bony ankylosis can rule out tuberculosis hip, but history suggests you tuberculosis. No, you cannot rule out, tuberculosis from bony ankylosis. See, in tuberculosis, sometimes can bony ankylosis occur in tuberculosis? You have to answer yes, it is possible whenever there is a secondary infection by a pathogenic organism. We always tell that. Sometimes, in tuberculosis, there is a sinus. So through the sinus, the pathogenic organisms can invade, and that can cause secondary infection. So you cannot exclude entirely. History may suggest you have tuberculosis, but clinical diagnosis is bony ankylosis, but it may be due to tuberculosis, or it may be due to secondary infection by, pathogenic organisms.
Right. Sir.
How to
Last question,
differentiate
sir. Yes, sir. Last
clinically
question.
bony from fibrous ankylosis? I told you that fibrous ankylosis, there will be jog of movements possible, and it will be any attempt to move the hip will less. Comparative possibility of getting an AVN in inhalational corticosteroid versus oral long-term corticosteroids in asthma. There is a possibility of getting, if it is a idiosyncratic effect, then whatever dose of steroid you take, it's not dose related. So whatever you take, there is a possibility of development of, avascular necrosis.
Right, sir. I think that
Can I-
completes
can I make
the
a
question.
comment?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Gopal,
Yes, sir. Please.
see, this question of the history suggestive of tuberculosis and the patient getting bony ankylosis, I have seen in couple of, especially the pediatric age group patients, they present like tuberculosis. The history, I have seen some of them taking anti-tubercular drugs, and then they have come to me. The investigations are, borderline raised ESR. The patient has got pain, he has got deformity. The X-rays are showing changes. But in fact, these are the patients who land up with acute chondrolysis.
Okay.
And these are the patients who go into bony ankylosis later on.
Oh,
So there can be a possibility that acute chondrolysis in the hip, which mimics presentation like tuberculosis, and they go into ankylosis. The patient may not develop any sinus, but then still there can be a bony ankylosis. And in hip, it is quite well known in pediatric age group that they can get this acute chondrolysis.
That
Gopakumar sir, do you agree on this point? Acute chondrolysis mimicking tuberculosis?
Chondrolysis, usually one differential diagnosis is tuberculosis, because it produces severe flexion deformity, abduction deformity, and usually an external rotation deformity with a marked limitation of movement. So it is usually seen in the young age group, that is teenage girls. So it usually mimics tuberculosis. But now there are certain classical MRI findings which helps us to distinguish between tuberculosis and this idiopathic chondrolysis. That is central area of hyperintensity in T2 scan with the corresponding hyperintensity that is seen in the acetabular side also. So this is classically described. And even there is a classification which came from Chennai, MMC, regarding the this MRI classification of idiopathic chondrolysis. So it always mimics tuberculosis. Okay, sir.
Sir, for the students' clarification, what is bony ankylosis and what is sound ankylosis? This is
Sound
all the
ankylosis
time,
is
and the students will get the
ankylosis
confusion. What is sound ankylosis, unsound ankylosis? What is the fibrous ankylosing and bony ankylosis?
Sound ankylosis is ankylosis in the functional position. Bony ankylosis is, you can, in a radiology, there is no movement possible, and in the X-ray, you can see the bony trabeculate crossing the joint. Fibrous ankylosis means some degree of movement, usually less than 5 degree is possible, and it is associated with pain. And some people divide it into long fibrous ankylosis and short fibrous ankylosis, depending upon the range of movement. If it is more than 5 to 10 degree, they call it long fibrous, and below 5 degree of movement, they call it short fibrous ankylosis. Okay.
Right, sir. I think it's Kalra sir is not there, but he might have reminded me 10 minutes back only. We have completed today's topic.
Mohanty sir, initially Mohanty sir was there. I'm sorry, Samantha.
Samantha sir, I have already apologized him because initially I have removed few people, and unfortunately his number was also not was there in that improper name or something like that.
मैंने फौरन चेंज कर लिया.
सर मैंने कर दिया था, ऑलमोस्ट 2-3 बार अनाउंस किया, रिस्पांस नहीं आया तो मैं कर दिया था, लेकिन समहाउ दूसरा उसी टाइम पे कोई ज्वाइन किया तो एक नंबर नीचे चला गया, तो कोई और कट गया सर उधर.
अब ये हमारा दूसरा कंप्यूटर है, उसने जो डाल दिया कंप्यूटर का नाम.
तो he sent me message. I requested him to join from other device, but I think his login ID on Zoom must have been the same. He must have used the same, so he was not able to log in. So I have to once Mohanty sir clears first link, I will send to him. That's what I promised to him. So I have to call him now.
पहला दिन था नया कंप्यूटर, सो कंप्यूटर पर्सन वाज विद मी, सो इमीडिएटली आई चेंज्ड. नहीं तो फिर आज गया था.
Right, sir. I think we have completed. We are really thankful to you, Mohanty sir, because your last class and this class, I think, is more than enough for PG or UG, or even for us as a consultant also, junior consultant like me. I think we are very lucky to have in our senior teaching team like Gopakumar sir, Kakatkar sir, Mohanty sir, Samantha sir, and Uday Kumar sir and Shivananda sir are they are also there. So on behalf of all students, I am really thankful to you, sir, for keeping us on our toes, because I thought your last lecture was the end, and today when I was listening to you, few more points, few additional points, I was getting through it. So the way you told us every time you read the S. Das, you feel you are understanding bit more concept in some other point. So I think I have started realizing, comparing only with your last 2 classes, faculty classes. Thank you very much, sir. And with all senior faculties, I will request Kakatkar sir to have your final comments, and I will close the meeting, sir. Kakatkar sir.
We are all thankful, Shubhranshu, to you for an excellent talk. And this being one of the most important talks for the practical examination, because as you rightly said, many of them, they get hip as a long case. I think it should be really beneficial to all the students who have attended today, and they should go and read it again, and they should, in their day-to-day ward rounds and ward work, they should practice examining the patient properly, writing down everything and presenting to their teachers, or if it is difficult to get the teacher immediately to present the case, and they can present to each other and practice, the presentation of a hip case. And I'm sure they will all be very grateful to you for this excellent talk, which will definitely help them to get through their exams. I think with these few words, I think we can close down the session today.